Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. It seemed like an opportune time, seeing as Kissinger has died, to look through the third of the Schwab articles that I wrote. The famous two, the most read two, are Schwab Family Values and Dr. Klaus Schwab, or How the CFR Taught Me to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. And the third one is the Kissinger Continuum, the unauthorized history of the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders program. And so this really, once I had discovered in Dr. Klaus Schwab that he had been recruited through a CIA-funded course at Harvard, where he had been trained by Henry Kissinger himself and been given John Kenneth Galbraith and Herman Kahn as mentors to go back and create the World Economic Forum proper. After that, I decided let's define what happened in the run-up to that and the CIA outfits and conduits that were involved in funding Kissinger's international seminar. The CIA obviously had an idea of what they wanted to do post their creation in 1947. They had a load of different plans for the future, and that comes out in this article, the Kissinger Continuum. And it's quite an interesting, I mean, the reason why it was called the Kissinger Continuum was because of the continuation of Kissinger's role as the organizer of a program to train up young global leaders outside the normal education establishment. So that's the continuum, because in 2004, as we'll find, Kissinger actually helped to fund the Young Global Leaders program, something that wasn't known before this article as well. And this is the lesser known, like I say, the lesser known. There's actually a fourth one as well about the German Marshall Fund, because once Kissinger, the CIA funded Kissinger's international seminar had been rumbled, they had to close the seminar down. And Abby Collins, who was running it for Kissinger, went across to the German Marshall Fund eventually, which was set up at Harvard by Guido Goldman, who's Kissinger's best friend. And they there started to do the international seminar, and what they were doing with the international seminar to a more industrial scale, you could say, and with a little bit more balls out. Now it was just going to be, look, this is funded by the Rockefellers and others in the CFR, and we're not going to hide what we're doing. And so this, that's a really interesting one. The following one is really interesting, but this one, the Kissinger Continuum, is extremely important to understanding as well how Henry Kissinger had an effect on our world. Because Henry Kissinger was a number one right old bastard of the highest order. I think we're all aware of that now, aren't we? So let me share your screen and say welcome to this Johnny Vedmore read-through of the Kissinger Continuum. There we are. We're going to read this on NEWSPASTE. It was originally put up on Unlimited Hangout. I don't know how long Unlimited Hangout's going to remain my stuff up there. So I have some articles on NEWSPASTE as well. And here we go. That's wonderful picture. This was the perfect picture to use for this article, because look at this. This is at the Davos. This is at the World Economic Forum, and look, it's Kissinger. He's on the big screen. He's looking across. What's really interesting here, look at all these different people. There's the Azerbaijan representative, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Moldova, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and they all got their name and their country, and then it's just Kissinger in big letters. Kissinger. Kissinger's like the globe, isn't he? He's the globalist. He's the perfect example for the globalist. So yeah, it's called the Kissinger Continuum, the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leader, the unauthorized history of the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leader program. Yes, they wouldn't authorize this history that I wrote about them. And here we go. Let me have a little sip of tea just before we start this. My cat's definitely wanting to get involved in all of this. Chow Chow. She's she likes the sound of it. So, Chow, what are you doing? Yeah, you might be able to hear her purr if you listen loud enough. The World Economic Forum's Young Global Leader program, Klaus Schwab's supposed brainchild, is actually an almost exact replica of Henry Kissinger's international seminar that was originally run out of Harvard and was funded by the CIA. In this article, Johnny Vedmore, that's me, investigates the people behind Kissinger's international seminar, the CIA conduits which funded the program, and Kissinger's key role in the creation of the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders program itself. If you don't know about this, then this is a stormer. This is a stormer. Okay. The World Economic Forum's Young Global Leader initiative has been responsible for seeding many of the ruling elite into positions of power and influence within the worlds of business, civil society, and most importantly, politics. The fall of the Soviet Union soon became an apparent catalyst for the creation of the Global Leaders for Tomorrow program, which was the precursor to the Young Global Leaders initiative over a decade later. However, the supposed mastermind of the project, the World Economic Forum's lifetime leader, Klaus Schwab, had himself already been helped into his own influential position by a very similar program run out of Harvard University that was heavily funded by the American Central Intelligence Agency. The Harvard initiative in question, often referred to as Henry Kissinger's International Seminar, was one of several programs set up by senior members of organizations such as the Council on Foreign Relations and the newly created CIA. In fact, during the post-war World War II era, the United States was proactively creating many such programs with the intention of grooming potential young foreign leaders and installing them into positions of power. The main motive behind the establishment of these programs was ostensibly to combat and prevent communist infiltration of foreign states, while also assuring that future global leaders would be amenable to U.S. interests. Originally, the United States created these secretive youth organizations with the aim of targeting potential future European leadership candidates. Yet soon, no country in the world would be safe from possible CIA-sponsored political infiltration. In this article, we will examine one of the front organizations which used vast amounts of CIA money to fund various Harvard projects, including Kissinger's International Seminar. We will learn who the people are who created these funding platforms, and we'll also look at other such educational initiatives, some still in existence today, which have helped American intelligence infiltrate governments worldwide. And here we go. This is a big one. So the CIA funding through Harvard, we're going to go through it, and this is really interesting. In 1967, it was Harvard's own Humphrey Dorman who exposed that certain Harvard summer school courses and initiatives were actually being funded via CIA conduits. Even though almost a decade of funding throughout the 1950s remained undeclared, it was revealed that between 1960 and 1966, Kissinger's International Seminar received funding from three CIA conduits: the Asian Foundation, the Farfield Foundation, and the American Friends of the Middle East. The latter being one of the more well-known, influential, and successful CIA conduits of the era. The CIA funded Harvard-based International Seminar, and the conduits which the Central Intelligence Agency used to supply the forum with necessary funds to run the program are of great historical significance. The American Friends of the Middle East was not just simply a front organization used to funnel secret CIA money into their various projects. In fact, there were some very big names attached to this prominent post-war organization. The AFME was considered to be an international educational organization and was formed the same year that Henry Kissinger launched the International Seminar at Harvard in 1951. There were 27 men and women who made up the AFME, which was led by Kermit Roosevelt Jr. and grandson of former American President Theodore Roosevelt. The CIA had been formed in 1947 from what was originally the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, and Kermit Roosevelt Jr. was extremely influential in the early years of both organizations. Kermit Roosevelt had been recruited by the mastermind behind the OSS, General William Joseph Wild Bill Donovan, in 1941, and he was soon placed into newly created Office of Coordinator of Information, the precursor to the OSS, as a special assistant to Dean Acheson. Working out of the State Department, Acheson, who was then the Assistant Secretary of State, had been tasked during World War II with implementing President Franklin Roosevelt's policy of undermining Axis powers while at the same time supplying economic aid to Great Britain. Kermit Roosevelt, who was distantly related to the president, had an affinity with the Middle East from a very young age, with the Daily Mail of Hagerstown in Maryland reporting in September 1948 that Mr. Kermit Roosevelt's career as a writer began when he was a child with the composing of prophetic poem, The Lure of the East, for the American Boy magazine. He was 11 at the time. Kermit's father, also named Kermit, had been in the shipping business, as mentioned in the latter article. This had made Kermit Jr. had meant that Kermit Jr. had traveled around the world at an early age. And there he is, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., a 1950 photo of Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt and a former Central Intelligence Agency official. He's, I think, fourth cousin, I think it's something like that, of a Roosevelt. So Franklin Roosevelt, who's in power during the war, of course. Kermit spent the war years serving in the Middle East and Italy, traveling extensively throughout the war, and was reported to have toured Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Palestine, Iran, and Ethiopia. His father had spent the war fighting mainly in Norway and Finland, but also served briefly in Egypt and died tragically in Alaska in 1943. The Abilene Reporter newspaper reported on Sunday, the 6th of June, 1943, that Kermit Sr. had passed away in Alaska the day before the article was published, with the paper noting, ordinarily, the phrase killed in action is used to report a death in combat. It was later confirmed that he had actually committed suicide. By this time, Kermit Jr. had already been recruited by the OSS. Kermit Jr. continued to work for the OSS as Middle East expert once the war had ended, and he also began writing and editing the history of the secretive organization. By 1947, the OSS had become the CIA, and Kermit was on the forefront of designing projects and programs for the newly founded intelligence agency. He also seemed genuinely concerned for the situation in the Middle East and soon took part in a lecture tour. That tour, whether sponsored by the CIA or not, saw Kermit argue passionately on behalf of those who were suffering in Palestine. In December 1947, Kermit began a lecture tour on a paper he had written concerning the Middle East, entitled "The Arabs Live There Too," which discussed the Palestinian problem and looked at the basic issues between the Arabs and Jews who inhabited the region. The report, which was published in the Evening Post, warned that the situation deserves more than a cursory glance from Americans. Kermit described Palestine as the UN's baby and stated that America had taken over the job as nurse and governess of the region. With the lecture tour was advertised in the Waukesha Daily Freeman on the 22nd of December 1947, with Roosevelt stating within the articles, applying the principle of one of their proverbs, "My enemy's enemy is my friend," the Arabs might move into closer alignment with the Soviet Union, going on to warn that Arabs will not blame Russia, who voted for partition in the UN, half as much as they will blame Britain and the United States. Kermit Roosevelt believed that the Arab League would stop short of all-out war, describing an official declaration of war by any of the 7 Arab nations as being extremely unlikely. Roosevelt was eventually proved correct about the Arab nations not declaring war immediately, and predicted instead that any time the Arabs felt themselves strong enough, they would surely try to recover Palestine. Before Kermit began his first covert operations in Arabic countries, he had been initially sent to Tibet by then-President Harry Truman to help ward off communist influence. The Delta Democrat Times of Mississippi reported on the 9th of April 1950 that Kermit Roosevelt, son of GOP president, is also being used on a confidential mission to block communism in Tibet. Kermit Roosevelt believed that forming alliances with Arab countries as they emerged from British and French rule would pay dividends for America while also preventing Soviet infiltration of Arabic nations. However, that strategy would rely on Western powers' ability to keep Arab nationalism at bay, whether by diplomacy or subterfuge. During 1943, Kermit worked for the State Department in Cairo, and this was one of the first Middle East countries in the post-war years to experience a CIA-backed coup d'etat. At the same time as Kissinger was commencing the pilot of the Harvard International Seminar in the early 1950s, Kermit Roosevelt was deeply involved in overthrowing the ruling Egyptian regime, running a special covert operation which was gingerly named Operation Fat Fucker, normally referred to as simply Operation FF. Egypt, at the turn of the 50s, was ruled by King Farouk, a notorious ruler who was already seen as corrupt in the eyes of most Egyptians. The project to depose him was led by CIA's then director Allen Dulles alongside CIA station chief in Cairo Miles Copeland Jr., Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and Kermit Roosevelt Jr., who was officially a CIA operative at the time, with the original aim of applying pressure on Farouk to enact certain political reforms within his country. When the initial pressure phase had failed, resulting in Farouk rejecting the American proposals, Kermit Roosevelt came up with the idea of how to orchestrate a peaceful revolution which would see both the required reforms enacted and the country more open to American control, as historian Matthew F. Holland puts it. Roosevelt met in secret with the Free Officers Movement, a nationalist revolutionary group which was led by Gamal Abdel Nasser and Mohammed Naguib, and which was already planning to overthrow the government. On the 23rd of July, 1952, a coup d'etat, which had been the brainchild of Roosevelt, saw Farouk forced into abdicating power, and he was sent into exile in Italy. The CIA-led coup had successfully installed a new government, which they believed would be more amenable to further American infiltration. The CIA would then help the newly installed Egyptian government to create a General Intelligence Agency, Egypt's own CIA clone organization. The following year, in March 1953, the then Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, directed the CIA, which was still headed by his brother Allen Dulles, to begin preparing a similar coup in Iran. The same people who had successfully installed Nasser in Egypt were given $1 million in funds, equivalent to $12,128,464,073 in 2022, which were there to be used to bring about the fall of Iranian government leader Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was successfully deposed on the 19th of August 1953 in a coup orchestrated by both the CIA and MI6, again led by AFME's Kermit Roosevelt Jr. In a project entitled Operation Ajax, the successful coups in Egypt and Iran were not spontaneous events, but were instead well executed and intricately planned operations. However, the Americans were soon to learn that if they were to continue to overthrow governments, they would first need to have effective American-aligned leaders already trained up and ready to install in their target countries. Before the newly created CIA had begun to enact the aforementioned coups in Egypt and Iran, Roosevelt had founded the Committee for Justice and Peace in the Holy Land, with many of the same people who would later make up the American Friends of the Middle East. The Committee for Justice and Peace in the Holy Land was formed in February 1948 by Roosevelt and a woman named Virginia Gildersleeve, whose sympathies, according to historian Robert Moats Miller, Hitler were indeed overwhelmingly with the Arabs, and was a leading figure in the Christian opposition to the creation of the Israeli state. Gildersleeve had been the long-term dean of Barnard College, but in 1947 she had stepped down from her position to concentrate on other activities. In February 1948, the New York Times reported that she led a group opposed to the creation of the UN police force in Palestine. The article, entitled "7 Leaders Proposed Truce in Palestine," also stated that the group's members were terming the present conflict in Palestine far more dangerous to world peace than most Americans realize, with the group stating, "We feel a moral and civic obligation to urge that most serious attention be given to our national policy in respect to Palestine." With that statement also being co-signed by Kermit Roosevelt. Also prominent alongside Gildersleeve and Roosevelt in the creation of the AFME was Harry Emerson Fosdick, an American pastor described as an active anti-Zionist and who later became a major influence to Martin Luther King Jr. Another notable member of the AFME was the controversial Dorothy Thompson. Thompson was an American journalist and radio broadcaster who had the honor of being the first American journalist to be expelled from Nazi Germany in 1934. Thompson was described in the 1939 Time magazine piece as being equal in influence to Eleanor Roosevelt, and was often referred to as the First Lady of American journalism. However, Thompson also held extreme views concerning America's black voting population, describing them as notoriously venal, ignorant, and illiterate. The vast mass of Negroes are like the lower strata of the early industrial immigrants, and like them are bossed and delivered in blocks by venal leaders, white and black. Thompson was a vocal anti-Zionist, coming to the conclusion that Zionism was a recipe for perpetual war. But even though Roosevelt, Gildersleeve, and Thompson are publicly opposed Zionism, the CIA in general would reap many benefits by creating a world which, if not in a state of perpetual war, was nearly always on the brink of perpetual war. The American Friends of the Middle East included some key people who were molding and influencing the post-war intelligence push. Even though we could find many interesting facts in studying all 27 members of the AFME, we now know that their interests focus on education and eventually resulted in the funding of a specific Harvard project that would create cadres of future international leaders who were amenable to America's political interests and desires, including Klaus Schwab. Just after World War II, there were many differing opinions within the American political establishment concerning what should be done about the Palestinian problem. Although many members of the American Friends in the Middle East may have been publicly anti-Zionist, an upsurge in Arab nationalism had been triggered by the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians following the creation of Israel in 1948. This initially resulted in a divide in public opinion, with many Americans eventually siding with the newly founded Israeli state and their occupying force. Popular opinion among Arabic countries was much less divided. The Arab League closed their offices in Washington, D.C., referred to as the Arab Office, in 1947, stating publicly that the United States had shown a complete and arrogant disregard for Arab rights, Arab interests, and Arab feelings. At this time, the United States was still heavily dependent on Arab oil, and the supply of this oil also relied on America having good relations with the Arabic world. The U.S. oil consortium, Aramco, could only continue benefiting from Arab petroleum if the U.S. stayed on good terms with the Saudi king, Ibn Saud, who was an extreme anti-Zionist. Aramco soon set up offices in Washington so as to lobby government on behalf of the Arabs, while also putting funds into educational institutions such as the Middle East Institute. Yet it wasn't only the Arab contingent of the American population who was concerned about the rise of Zionism, with the American Council for Judaism objecting to Zionism because they believed that that it conflated religion and nationality. Rabbi Elmer Berger of Michigan, who was an American Council for Judaism leader at the time, campaigned for American Jews to stop supporting the creation of the State of Israel. At the time, the State Department had also been worried about throwing their lot in with the Zionists. They were mainly concerned with the potential for the growth of communist influence in Arab countries if the US showed too much support for the newly created State of Israel. According to historian Hugh Wilford, it was to be Cairo-based former OSS member who acted as the nexus of the network that would become the American Friends of the Middle East. As he makes note of in the paper entitled American Friends of the Middle East, the CIA, US citizens, and the secret battle for public opinion in the Arab-Israeli conflict 1947 to 1967. Wilford also points out that Kermit Roosevelt associated with many anti-Zionists of the period. For example, he was actually under the command of an anti-Zionist descendant of missionaries named Stephen B. L. Penrose Jr. Roosevelt had also shared a room with George L. Levison, a State Department officer of Jewish descent, who later introduced Roosevelt to such leaders as the aforementioned Elmer Berger. Roosevelt, Levison, and Berger all became close friends, with Levison eventually being godparent to one of Roosevelt's children. Roosevelt was not only vital in setting up the original iteration of the American Friends in the Middle East, the Committee for Justice of Peace in the Justice and Peace in the Holy Land. He also ran the organization out of Washington Home alongside the organization's secretary Garland Evans Hopkins. Eventually, the anti-Zionist activists within the government failed in their efforts to prevent the creation of the State of Israel when President Harry Truman officially recognized Israel's sovereignty. Roosevelt continued to undermine future support for Israel, and a year after Truman's recognition of the country, Roosevelt and others formed the Holy Land Emergency Liaison Program, HELP, which was to coordinate aid for displaced Arabs in the region, while also working to, as Hugh Wilford puts it, reduce U.S. support for Israel. It is also around this time when Dorothy Thompson and others began to raise the profile of Roosevelt's organization. The battle for hearts and minds and the souls of future global leaders. The Harvard Summer School had been running for over 75 years by the time Henry Kissinger was finishing his studies at the university. In 1950, Kissinger achieved his Bachelor of Arts degrees in political science and during his studies had received much attention from some very powerful Harvard grandees. In 1951, Kissinger launched a Harvard magazine entitled Confluence, which was to run alongside the International Seminar, and became the publication's editor. This quarterly magazine was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and received contributions from others who were described as various luminaries who had previously been lecturers or students at the summer school. The International Seminar was later boosted by extra funds totaling at least $135,000, $1,637,342.74 in 2022 by the Central Intelligence Agency between 1960 and 1966 alone, with any previous CIA funding since the seminar's creation in 1950 being left undeclared. Harvard Summer School's International Seminar Forum had originally been the brainchild of William Yandell Elliott, an important mentor of Kissinger who took a back seat and remained out of the public eye. After the pilot event for the International Seminar Forum in 1951, the young Kissinger wrote to William Yandell Elliott saying, "I was very much embarrassed to hear myself described as the guiding genius of the seminar," going on to say, "I, for one, have no illusions in this score." Subsequently, the majority of the participants would recall the influence of Kissinger rather than Elliott, with the forum eventually being commonly referred to as Kissinger's International Seminar. The CIA money for what was described as a foreign seminar came via a known CIA conduit, the aforementioned Kermit Roosevelt's American Friends in the Middle East. Kissinger and his biographer would claim that he was unaware of the organization's intelligence ties, describing Kissinger as flying into a rage upon learning that the American Friends in the Middle East was actually a front for the CIA. However, Kissinger's letters to H. Gates Lloyd during this period told a different story. They show that Kissinger had carefully itemized the expenses of the summer school. Other documents within William Yandell Elliott's papers also reveal that Kissinger may have even acted as a contract consultant for the Office of Policy Coordination (OPC), which was the covert operation wing of the Central Intelligence Agency. In fact, Elliott had written a letter to Lloyd on the 15th of November 1950, which urged progress with the summer school proposal and the creation of Kissinger's International Seminar. With that letter came certain papers directed to Kissinger himself, which showed he had discussed the proposal with Cleveland Cram, an infamous and powerful early member of the Central Intelligence Agency. Cram had originally sought a career in academia, but was recruited by the CIA in 1949. He was soon liaising with Yandell, Elliott, and Kissinger concerning the Harvard Summer School project, and after it was up and running, Cram was sent to London to become the deputy station chief and the official liaison between the CIA, MI5, and MI6. In this CIA-Harvard nexus of the late 1940s and early 1950s came the formation of what would, a generation later, evolve into the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leader Initiative. One of the original reasons for the creation of the CIA had been to counter Soviet influence in foreign countries, and they used multi-pronged attack strategy to achieve their aims. While Allen Dulles, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., and their secret army were organizing and enacting coups d'etats in country after country, other CIA-linked organizers and contributors were beginning to create the infrastructure that would allow them to recruit, train, and install young European leaders into positions of power, leaders who they believed were unlikely to be susceptible to potential Soviet influence. Harvard was not alone in funding such projects. In fact, as Hugh Wilford notes in his fascinating and informative book, The Mighty Wurlitzer, Yale was the single most fertile recruiting ground for the agency in its first years, yielding, among others, Cord Meyer and two of the brightest stars of the golden age of covert operations, Richard Bissell and Tracy Barnes. Also noted by Wilford are Yale's James J. Angleton and Norman Holmes Pearson. The latter, Wilford notes, had graduated from Yale before serving in the OSS and returned to the university after the war in order to set up the American Studies program. The CIA were essentially trying to win hearts and minds of young foreigners in direct competition with the Soviet Union. The communists had already been busy targeting the impressionable youth for over 25 years before the end of World War II, with Wilhelm Willy Munzenberg, a German-born communist activist, being the first leader of the Young Communist International, Comintern, as early as 1919. In 1945, a conference took place in London, which saw the launch of the anti-imperialist World Federation of Democratic Youth. The following year saw the founding of another group with some members sympathetic to communist ideals such as the World Federation of Trade Unions and the International Union of Students. The latter had been created in Prague and saw a 25-member intelligence-linked U.S. delegation attend. As these entities were created, they each became virtual battlegrounds for East versus West ideology and the clash of Rhodesian imperialist capitalism and Soviet communism. In fact, the World Federation of Democratic Youth saw Cold War rifts in their organizations soon fester, and by 1949, the non-communists had publicly withdrawn from the group, going on to create the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions instead. These sorts of organizations were invaluable instruments for spreading communist propaganda and had been defined by Lenin as levers or transmission belts because of the way they connect Communist Party with the masses and were often referred to as democratic or mass organizations in communist jargon. As a pamphlet entitled Facts About International Communists from Front Organizations described in April 1957. In that particular pamphlet, a quote from Lenin, which it also appears in Lawrence and Wishart's 1947 book, The Essentials of Lenin, Volume 2, states, "Every sacrifice must be made. The greatest obstacles must be overcome in order to create an agitation and propaganda systematically, perseveringly, and patiently, precisely in those institutions, societies, and associations, even the most reactionary, to which proletarian or semi-proletarian masses belong. In essence, the CIA's creation and funding of youth organizations and their wider infiltration of American universities was a strategy that essentially came out of Lenin's own playbook. For the CIA's involvement, the British had been the ones taking before the CIA's involvement. Sorry, the British had been the ones taking the initiative by targeting the youth of Europe with the aim of countering Communist Party infiltration. The Cultural Relations Department was tasked with developing strategies relevant to Western-aligned youth groups, organizations, and conferences. The first of such groups was the World Assembly of Youth, WEF, which had been given a draft charter in England in February 1949. All youth-related member organizations of the United Nations were invited to attend the international conference held at Westminster Hall in August the same year. Here, they officially established WEF and elected their first president, Mr. Maurice Suave of Canada. It was around this time that the Americans first began organizing their efforts to educate the youth, which eventually led to such initiatives as Henry Kissinger's International Seminar. At Harvard, the International Affairs Committee, HIACOM, began gathering a group of young veterans who had worked within intelligence during World War II in an effort to rival the much more advanced communist propaganda efforts. In December 1946, HIACOM officers were involved in organizing a meeting in Chicago which discussed the idea of creating a national body to represent American students, as well as a wider American interest at international events. As a result, by the summer of 1947, the United States National Students Association, the NSA, was born. For the 2 years prior to the launch of Kissinger's International Seminar, Harvard students had conducted surveys of international student opinion in order to identify potential anti-communist allies overseas, while also poaching potential members from rival organizations such as the International Union of Students. The National Students Associations had their second survey funded by 2 very interesting private donors via the Office for Policy Coordination, the Chicago lawyer and president of the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, Laird Bell, and the Wilmington industrialist named Thomas Brittingham. Each provided the princely sum of $6,000 to the organization specifically to carry out the survey. Laird Bell was an extremely influential and well-connected lawyer who had found himself frequently visiting Nazi Germany just before World War II in order to represent the interests of US bondholders who had lost more than $1 billion to the German Reichsbank. Bell would not be alone in working in the pre-war Nazi Germany, as his co-counsel for these cases was John Foster Dulles, who was representing the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. By 1945, Bell was officially serving in post-war occupied Germany, and Eisenhower soon appointed him as a delegate to the United Nations. In 1948, Laird Bell became an overseer of Harvard College, where he stayed until 1954, throughout the creation of the International Seminar. Thomas Brittingham was extremely important in the development of America's effort to win over skeptical foreign youth, especially in Northern Europe, setting up the Brittingham Scholarships just after the war. He targeted the youth in Scandinavian countries. Also referred to as the Viking students, he would attract young men to his collection of scholarship programs, which would eventually become named the Brittingham Viking Scholarships, and which were run out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Many of Tom's Vikings, as they were also called, would become successful in organizations that the program's current website describe as their various industries, academic fields, and politics. See some Brittingham Vikings just below there. Although there were many different youth groups throughout the various educational establishments across the United States, Kissinger's International Seminar at Harvard Summer School was a very unique project. It was a focused event with a limited number of participants who were carefully chosen by a select few. The Harvard Crimson reported on the 1st of February 1956 that a group of approximately 50 men and few women from the Orient, Middle East, and Europe, including members of various parliaments, editors, artists, writers, and other cultural leaders, will once more come together to form the International Seminar, a regular feature of the summer school. This was a special elite group selected, groomed, and trained for powerful positions, with their allegiances forever tied to the interests of United States governments. And for those interests, would soon begin to fluctuate wildly over the following decades. The Kissinger Continuum. By 1992, the Berlin Wall had fallen, and the education of Schwab's specially selected globalist politicians of the future was just about to begin. During this time of great political change, Schwab's World Economic Forum had become a powerful globalist entity, and Schwab was ready to begin following the model first established by Kissinger's CIA-funded International Seminar. As Herman Kahn and his Hudson Institute colleagues had mapped out in 1967 document entitled Ancillary Pilot Study for Educational Policy Research Center Program Final Report, training a comprehensive future leadership group outside of the normal educational framework was of the highest priority. As previously reported, Kahn was yet another mentor to Klaus Schwab. The first iteration of the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leader program, called Global Leaders for Tomorrow, was launched in 1992 and was described as a new community, which saw its first gathering of future leadership candidates take place in 1993. Some of the people who attended these first events were soon placed at the top positions of power in their respective countries. For example, Tony Blair was a participant of the first event, and only 4 years later, he began his decade-long rule of the UK. Gordon Brown also attended in 1993 and then served alongside Tony Blair, eventually becoming Prime Minister directly afterwards. This initial group was full to the brim with other future leaders and many members who were destined to become the heads of state in their respective countries. Well-known leaders who attended include Angela Merkel of Germany, Viktor Orban of Hungary, Nicolas Sarkozy of France, Guy Verhofstadt of Belgium, Lee Hsien Loong of Singapore, Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, and Jose Maria Aznar, Spain. Alongside these politicians in the first group, there were also notable business leaders in attendance, such as Bill Gates, Richard Branson, Larry Summers, and Edgar Bronfman. In total, the first year, the Global Leaders for Tomorrow program was comprised of 200 potential candidates who were all under 43 years old at the time. For over a decade, the Global Leaders for Tomorrow program trained many elected officials. In 2004, the Global Leaders for Tomorrow program was rebranded as the Forum of Young Global Leaders and was relaunched after Schwab found funding from an old friend. The Harvard Kennedy magazine of summer 2009 starts their lead article by stating, "Through alumni and teaching, Harvard Kennedy School plays central role in Forum of Young Global Leaders program," with the author Steve Nadis writing, "In 2004, Klaus Schwab, MC, MPA, 1967, a Harvard Kennedy School graduate who founded the World Economic Forum, won a $1 million prize from the Dan David Foundation and tried to think of the best way he could use that money. Schwab decided to start a World Economic Forum affiliated program called the Forum of Young Global Leaders, which, as the name applies, will bring together a new generation of leaders from across the globe and turn them loose on the biggest problems of the day." Astoundingly, the Tel Aviv-based Dan David Foundation that awarded Schwab the $1 million, which was directly used to create the Young Global Leaders program, had one extremely significant member of note on their board, Henry A. Kissinger. Harvard's International Seminar and the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leader Initiative were created to be extremely powerful vehicles for training and installing world leaders who would be sympathetic to a Kissinger-style globalist government. They were also both made possible by organizing assistance and funding from Kissinger themselves. It isn't a surprise that Schwab's links with Kissinger prevailed throughout both their lifetimes. Schwab was a student of Henry Kissinger, and the two men also appeared to share many similar views. Yet, what is really notable about Harvard's summer school, and Kissinger's international seminar in particular, is that the program's conference and the basic elements involved were very similar to what the World Economic Forum still presents to their members annually to this day. They are extremely similar projects aimed at achieving similar agendas. When the World Economic Forum began the Global Leaders for Tomorrow initiative in the early 1990s, Klaus Schwab's organization implemented a program of recruitment and training for global leaders, which was almost indistinguishable from Kissinger's CIA-funded international seminar. Schwab was treading in the footsteps of his mentor, Henry Kissinger, and it was the Dan David Foundation, while Kissinger was seated on their board, which eventually awarded Schwab with the initial funding required to create the current iteration of the program, the Forum for Young Global Leaders. Here's Klaus Schwab and others aboard the flight to Ukraine in 1993 for the World Economic Forum annual meeting. Yet, fall of the fall of communism. A few years later, the Global Leaders for Tomorrow programs going, and the World Economic Forum go to Ukraine instead of Davos. Very interesting. The World Economic Forum has spawned many globalist-aligned heads of states, cabinet ministers, business leaders, entrepreneurs, and other powerful actors. Through their Global Leaders for Tomorrow and Young Global Leaders initiatives, Schwab has even spoken openly on how his organization has gone on to penetrate the cabinets of supposedly foreign sovereign states. And we should not be naive, as he has been planning on doing exactly this for at least 3 decades. However, it isn't the thousands of participants who have completed this program who we should be most concerned about. Our real concern should be with the billions of democratic voters who have been tricked into believing that any of the leaders produced by either Schwab or Kissinger have their best interests at heart. Klaus Schwab became the heir to Henry Kissinger's most important project, the infiltration of individuals and organizations in countries around the world with the aim of creating globalist-aligned governments built within the framework of an outdated and soulless conceptualization of American imperialism. Klaus Schwab's activities since his time at Harvard can be seen as simply a direct continuation of Kissinger's work during the 1950s and 1960s. And it would be naive of us to believe that there is not someone else already groomed and trained who is ready and willing to pick up Kissinger's political baton from Schwab and continue in their joint mission towards global governance. There you go. There you go. Cats and dogs snuffling around the place. Not sure if you can hear that, but that's happening right now. You can support my work on NEWSPASTE. If you want to support me, if you want me to write more things like this, you need to support me directly. You can become a patron. You can buy me a coffee. There's actually other ways to donate on the site. You can also patrons get loads of early stuff, and I'm planning on giving them much more as well when there's more. I've only got a small band of supporters at the moment. I've just monetized the NEWSPASTE YouTube, so you can go there and become a member or a subscriber, drop me some funds, and I can put that towards writing more articles like this. I think this was a really important article to write. Let me close this screen and talk to you properly. There you go. Hi. Let me get a tea. It was a long read. I didn't have much of a drink or smoke through that, did I? So it's really important to understand why that was necessary to write. When I discovered that the Kissinger's International Seminar had been a CIA-funded organization and that Klaus Schwab had gone through it, it wasn't enough for me. I had researched Schwab's upbringing, his father. I had written Schwab's family values, and I thought, wow, I discovered that Klaus Schwab's father was a Nazi who ran a model Nazi company that was central to the atomic bomb program. And then later, Schwab went on to help the same company merge with another company while selling nuclear technology to the apartheid South African regime. That was a bit of a like knock it out of the park sort of article. Never, I looked so hard to find a follow up to that, and then to find that the CIA funding link. I What I try and explain to people is that when I finished the Schwab family values, kind of like it was, and then Schwab grew up, and then he went and formed the World Economic Forum. And then I was looking at the beginning of the World Economic Forum and stuff, and it was really hard to understand how it had started, what had given him the impetus, and that led me to spend a year looking at everything that was going on at the time, all of the search for links, and eventually stumbled across the CIA funding of Kissinger's International Seminar. And that was really massively important. That was a change in everything, a change in pace of those articles, because it was like, okay, I'm onto a trail now. And this trail is more than one article for sure. It had to keep going. Because by the end of giving you the mentors and giving you an understanding of how it was a CIA funded program that was really written up in the policy institutes such as Council on Foreign Relations and brought to fruition, like the World Economic Forum project was brought to fruition by really the Council on Foreign Relations members pushing Schwab forward in that way. And that was really important to understand. Understanding how Kissinger rose to power was really important to understand. But then that led to this, which was understanding how you get to a point where the CIA is funding courses in Harvard. And it's quite simply they want to get one up on the communists before the communists get them. You know, there's communists are going for students, let's get there first. And so that's what they do. That's what they do. They put in a load of money targeting children, the youth, children, young adults, and future potential, looking for future potential leadership candidates. And it is a really interesting fact that the people who created the CIA at the beginning were all anti-Zionists. I mean, that changes in 1967, really suddenly. Boom! As soon as 1967 happens, then you see like these people get so much pressure from the press and stuff that they all change. And then that rhetoric of America being like supporter of an Israel and turning a blind eye to the Zionist sort of like side of it all, that really starts coming quickly. Then that really is a big rolling ball going downhill and leading us to where we are today. So, you know, the anti-Zionist element of the CIA got knocked out pretty quickly. But even the anti-Zionists bent the knee and accepted that they were going to do all of these other things as well for the CIA and for American hegemony, knowing that it included a recognition of Israel and the loss of Palestine for as it was or as it could have been. And they really, there was a load of people who really saw that would mean perpetual war in the future. But then in the 1950s, late 50s, Kissinger and his allies are suddenly developing the idea of limited perpetual warfare. And so it suits their ideology. And maybe they already kind of knew that before. And so they're developing these coups and these other things and the creation of the State of Israel to destabilize the region constantly. And that seems to be what it is. And where they started off was like, we gotta do the youth groups. We gotta subvert all youth organizations as quickly as possible. From 1945, 1946, 1947, that's what they did after the war. The British and Americans, the intelligence put a load of effort into getting control of youth groups. And so that also led to things like the Vienna festivals, infiltration by the independent, the information services, the Independent Services for Information, or whatever it was called, the Gloria Steinem project, set up again at Harvard. Bebchik and others involved in that, and people who were there, heads of the National Student Association, former heads, had recruited Steinem in India. When she gets back, she works for the CIA, and she starts organizing the American entourage to these Soviet heavy youth festivals, and it really showed the start of this West versus East, and the battle was at the ground level, at the youth. So the Kissinger Continuum is really important, because then you get to see how later on that developed into being the Young Global Leaders, but Global Leaders for Tomorrow, and gave us all of these leaders that we know today, who have all been in charge. And then by 2004, and the giving of the £1 million prize money by the Dan David Foundation, while Kissinger's on the board, meant that Schwab could then continue. And really, it just seems to be other ways. Just at one point, like, you have to wonder, like, CIA is not the only tool, the CFR is not the only tool, but they're all tools that are used for this agenda. And they're used by people who are ideologues, who are pushing along an agenda that is bigger than the CFR, bigger than the CIA, and is left in the hands of a very few who we don't have access to, and we don't get to see the workings out, the sums, the sum of all fears, no, the sums that make up the world we are in today. So there you go. The Kissinger Continuum, a read through by me, Johnny Vedmore. And I will be doing more read-throughs, of course. I'll be continuing with the Pottinger read-throughs. Expect the Searching for Stanley documentary to come out soon, and that's also going to touch on some of these things, including Gloria Steinem. There's a Gloria Steinem episode already available for the patrons. Listen, if you become a patron, whatever level, you get on the credits of Searching for Stanley, because my patrons are funding me to make this documentary, funding me to make this article. So if you get involved and help me out, then you get something. You get your name in lights. You get your name attached to a documentary that is going to be, this is the first part of at least 4 parts, and it's coming out soon. And you can already watch the first 3 draft part sections, or 3 of the draft sections, already out on my Patreon, and another one coming out tomorrow. So there'll be 4 by the time this one comes out, that you can already see half of the documentary, in a sense, or there's going to be extras that I'm holding back as well. But basically, it's going to lead to explaining. It's going from all the way from the start, from Watergate and all the way through to Epstein, and it's one thread throughout the entire thing. Stanley Pottinger, well worth a look. I'll also probably do a read-through eventually of the article that follows this up, which is the German Marshall Fund article. That's useful for people to understand. I'm also probably going to start doing read-throughs of the Black Hand series, because that's a series that I'm probably going to develop eventually into a book, maybe, over time. And like I say, you get on the ground level, come support my work. Even if you're just like chucking me $5 a month, that means you are you're helping me produce my work. You're helping me produce my work. You're part of this, and I need you. I really do need you, because times are tough. Times are tough for everybody, but I tell you, I don't make a lot, and I need to start actually making enough to survive, because otherwise I'm going to have to find a normal job, go back into the mines and start digging the coal. What do you mean the coal industry is dead? Damn you, Kissinger! Anyway, so thank you for being with me. This is Johnny Vedmore Read Through, and this was NEWSPASTE on newspaste.com. Come support the work, like, share, subscribe, and out. See you later.
Young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina, and so on, that we penetrate the cabinets.